Hello, my name is Shalini Bhutani. I'm a legal researcher and policy analyst. I work on issues of law and their interface with communities and conservation. I've been looking at the issues of biosafety for almost 2 decades now, and that's what I'll be sharing with you today. The whole issue of biosafety and the legal concerns that surround them. So let's just try and capture for you what is the scope of the presentation. We'll start with trying to understand the concept of biosafety, look at the role of law in current day science and technology. We'll also take a glimpse at the international law on the subject of biosafety. We'll then spend a few moments on the Indian situation. And apart from the laws and regulations, we'll also take a look at some of the court cases on this issue. And we'll wrap with some of the related laws apart from those concerned specifically with biosafety, and try and give you a complete overview of the issue of how it's developing. Okay, to start with, what do we understand by biosafety? When you use the word bio, it kind of indicates living organisms, and safety, as you know, talks of security, but this is biological safety, which means the safety, issues of safety around living modified organisms. So living modified organisms, the processes that make them, as well as the end products called living modified organisms, are all products of modern technology. And so you need law on LMOs, not only to regulate the safety of those handling LMOs, that is the scientists in the lab, but when that LMO is released in the open, so in the open society, in a natural environment. So a biosafety law essentially captures the relationship between science and society. And LMOs, living modified organisms, which are also interchangeably used with the term GMOs, are made by human intervention in naturally existing life forms. So the important thing to understand when studying a law on biosafety is that the law has to deal with living forms that nature has not made. So we're dealing with, in a sense, unnatural living forms. And what are the most talked of examples of LMOs and GMOs? Because these can be developed in any sector, whether in agriculture, in forestry, in fisheries, used for industrial application, or for pharmaceuticals. So there's a whole range of how LMOs are used in different sectors. And so there would be sector-specific biosafety regulation. But let's just look at one of the most controversial examples, and that is LMOs or GMOs in the seed sector, and that is genetically modified crops. And the most talked of amongst those is transgenic cotton, which has the gene of Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a living microorganism found in soil. The gene of that inserted into a cotton genome. So yes, it does take a lot of understanding science apart from just being a student of law. And so it's easier to then draw the linkage between the developing law and the developing science. And this is an example where law has had to keep pace with so-called modern technology, because living modified organisms are something that are believed to have developed from modern biotechnology. And since they are unnatural, have not existed in nature before, they interact in unpredictable ways with the natural world around them. And that introduces the element of uncertainty. This is a key issue or a key challenge that biosafety laws have to deal with. because then the law on biosafety would need to provide for not only risk assessment of how do you assess the risk of GMOs and LMOs, and also the risk management. And these have been recognized internationally as focal areas for capacity building for all the countries that have to deal with the issue of biosafety. In the law that is developing within India, which is the Biotechnology Regulatory Authority of India bill, there is a specific provision to set up a risk assessment unit for purely science-based safety assessments. But there are much larger public concerns beyond the science, which means other considerations need to be brought into the picture and thoroughly examine GMOs from the point of view of socioeconomic implications. This is also a call being given by civil society as well as concerned scientists within the community itself that is developing GMOs. Now, the international law on the subject is contained in the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and I start with that because that's where the definition of an LMO is given, an internationally recognized definition of LMO, which is any living organism that possesses a novel combination of genetic material obtained through the use of modern biotechnology. Then how does biosafety become a legal issue? And when does a problem get picked up for policy making and law? Because there is a lot of activity world over around making of laws on biosafety. But the fact that it has all these risks and these uncertainties that need to be factored in, and also because law inherently is about the establishment of normative values, means it helps to move from what is the current situation to what ought to be. So biosafety means what is the level of safety that ought to be when we are dealing with LMOs. At a practical level, a biosafety law will have to provide for the protection of human and ecological health, and that is the core objective of any biosafety law. But not only is the issue of LMOs or GMOs challenging, it is the aspect of GMOs that makes it, there are several aspects of GMOs that make it such a challenge for lawmaking. Firstly, because of the inherent internal nature of the issue, which means you can develop an LMO, you can be the best scientist to have developed it, you can write the perfect law, but bees and birds don't follow or don't read biosafety laws. And so there are inherent limitations of the technology itself, and when the technology is released in the open environment. And the fact is that the law cannot control every natural process happening naturally in the natural environment. And therefore, that creates a certain limitation for the law itself, that you can only regulate that much. Also, in the open environment, apart from the natural environment, the political environment itself has changed. So you have to situate the issue of LMOs within a world which has gone through a paradigmatic shift. In the political economy, GMOs is not simply a product of science. It is actually a product of technology, which is the commercial application of that science. At a time where capitalism and products to be sold in the free market are given much more protection under a legal system than perhaps social and ecological considerations. So what role can law play in this, whether that's the national law or the international law on biosafety? Like any other law, a biosafety law would also need to regulate human behavior. It would then also need to prescribe rules by which it seeks to regulate human behavior. And if there is any digression from any of those prescribed behavior, then the law has to impose penalties and be able to pin liability as well as be able to get redress for any kind of damage that might result from LMOs or GMOs. So what are the possible legal approaches that a legal system can take? Because different countries in the world have different positions ranging from for and against LMOs. There are also very vibrant social movements on this issue and much activism within the legal circles as well. And it's good to get a flavor of the different positions that people can take depending on how comfortable they are with the idea of commercializing and using LMOs in different sectors. And a country's legal system can choose to say no through its biosafety law, and even if it says no, it still needs to regulate human behavior so that having declared itself to be GMO free, it would then pin liability or responsibility on those who introduce LMOs into its GM free area territories. Or through a biosafety law, a country could impose a moratorium, which means to say, to signal that they're not yet ready to go out for a full-out application and use of this technology. They could also take a more cautious approach, which is a yes but approach, which means let's do a case-by-case assessment of LMOs and GMOs and then verify and be satisfied by their safety and only then release it after putting them through an independent assessment procedure, which also looks at socioeconomic considerations and not only from a scientific point of view. Or a fourth legal approach that a country could take would be to be completely pro LMOs and say, yes, we are okay with going ahead with using and commercializing genetically modified products of all kind in all sectors, and therefore we need a biosafety law only to regulate the use and to ensure that once it's being used, it is done so safely and with due precaution. Which brings us to the environmental law principles that are supposed to underlie any law, whether it's a national or the international law, on biosafety. There are three environmental law principles that must underlie any legislation or international law on treaty on biosafety. And there are three principles. The first, the precautionary principle. The second, the polluter pays principle. And the third, the principle of sustainable development. You are familiar with the precautionary principle because that since the 1992 Earth Summit that was held in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil laid down that given the lack of scientific certainty of a certain product of science, that is no reason if we don't have enough trials done or even enough assessments done within laboratory conditions or in open field trials, for instance, for GMOs, given that there is lack of scientific certainty on their safety, is no reason to take a precautionary approach when using these LMOs or GMOs. The second is the polluter pays principle. That means the operator or the developer of GMOs must be responsible and must pay costs in case there is any damage to biodiversity or to human health apart from ecological health that might occur. The third principle of sustainable development, which is currently emerging in international law, requires that any use of science and technology must be done so responsibly that it doesn't jeopardize the use of biological resources by generations that are yet to come. That means the pace as well as the quality of development and the model of development that we choose should not put at risk and the possibilities of development for future. And that is also linked with the issue of intergenerational justice. So apart from the principles, let's now zoom right into the international law on biosafety. which is developed under a multilateral environmental agreement, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity. CBD, as we know it, came into force in 1993. And so the issue of biosafety is as old as that, and perhaps older, when the technology actually developed in the 70s and the 80s, much before the international law could keep pace with that. But 10 years after the CBD came into force, a specific protocol, which is a daughter treaty or a sub-treaty to the CBD, which is called the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, came into force in 2003. Now, this protocol is what is the international law on biosafety. It attempts to strike a balance between trade interests in biotechnology as well as the protection of biological diversity. And within the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety, there is a very specific provision which asks for liability and redress provisions to be addressed. And it was only in 2010 that a further supplementary protocol on liability and redress, called the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Protocol on Liability and Redress, protocol called the Supplementary Protocol, it has been developed, and this is to deal with issues of liability between countries when LMOs are either transported across borders and used for food, feed and processing. And it also provides, apart from the liability provisions, also provides for redress, which means if it is established on evidence that there has been damage to biological diversity or to human health because of that particular LMO transported from another country, then the sender or the operator, and there are definitions given within the text of this supplementary protocol which defines who will be made liable. In that case, when it is established that damage has occurred, then the whole machinery of the supplementary protocol then focuses on trying to get redress and for the polluter to pay. So this is premised on the principle of polluter pays. Now, apart from the specific legislation that are developing in different countries on the issue of biosafety, we'll also look at some of the regulation, because not all countries have made full legislation that have gone through the parliament, but have made executive rules to deal with the issue of biosafety. And even though the proponents of LMOs and GMOs would like us to believe that GMOs and their application has become the norm worldwide, this is hardly true, because in about 245 countries that we have in the world today, just about 29 or 30 countries have begun to use LMOs or GMOs in different sectors. So in India, what does the biosafety regime look like? We are in a state of transition between the existing regulation, which are executive rules called the Genetically Engineered Rules of 1989, which have been issued under the Umbrella Environment Protection Act of 1986. And it is the Environment Ministry, which is the nodal governmental agency at the central level to deal with the issue of biosafety. Yet, there is much discussion on a legislative initiative, because we have a draft Biotechnology Regulatory Authority of India bill, which is supposed to be tagged with the Ministry of Science. And the questions that are being asked by civil society quite legitimately is, if we are in the process of developing an independent regulatory authority on biotechnology, then this should not be in any way seen close to the Ministry of Science and Technology, which is the nodal governmental agency at the central level to promote this technology. Otherwise, this would be typically a case of conflict of interests. But there is a timeline, even though there is this discussion on developing a full-fledged biosafety legislation is ongoing. There is a specific timeline for national law to be developed, and this timeline has been prescribed by the international law contained in the Cartagena Protocol, which says that member countries of the Cartagena Protocol, and there are 160 countries today that are a member of this protocol, all the countries that are members are required to set up legal and administrative frameworks by the year 2020. It's important to note here that the United States of America, which is the biggest promoter and developer of modern biotechnology, is not a member of the Cartagena Protocol and therefore does not subscribe to the law on biosafety as it is developed internationally. This is important to keep in mind because when we get into the national landscapes and see what are the challenges for regulatory bodies, we also have to place it within the political economy and understand the kind of players that are behind the biosafety regulation. So then what are the regulatory bodies within India under its safety regime? There are three main bodies which have been set up through the genetically engineered rules, and this is the review committee on genetic manipulation called the RCGM. Then every body or research institute which does research and development on LMOs and GMOs is supposed to have an institutional biosafety committee. And then at the central level, at the Ministry of Environment and Forests, is a Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, the GEAC, which is supposed to not only clear large-scale field trials, but also assess the safety of LMOs or a GM product to approve or to disapprove its use and its commercial application. So there is a detailed procedure that is followed. Biosafety protocols are set up at the research level when they are in contained conditions within a laboratory setup. But when they cross that laboratory stage, an experimental stage, and have to be experimented in the open field, that's the time when the GEAC comes into play and the role of the GEAC gets activated, because then the proponent has to file an application giving details of its product, the LMO that has been developed. And interestingly, the Ministry of Environment and Forests has been given the last call to decide on the recommendations given by the GEAC. So the Indian experience with GMOs and LMOs is most vibrant in the case of genetically modified crops. And apart from the regulatory regime contained in the executive rules, this issue has been before the Supreme Court of India since the late 90s, when the first 100 grams of BT was imported into India. And since then, since the late 90s, there have been public interest litigation that has been going on in the Supreme Court. And the current case that is pending before the Apex Court is that of Aruna Rodrigues and others versus Union of India and others. The full petition and the grounds on which it has been filed are all available online, and I would encourage you to read the text. And so that is an ongoing a process within the court of law, and therefore it's important to see what role even courts can play in the developing biosafety regime in terms of either imposing stay orders or asking for a certain independent safety body to be set up, or to pin liability on the institutes that are undertaking R&D. And there have been other legal fora within the country and outside which have also had to deal with different aspects of LMOs. And it's useful to recall here the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Commission, a body which has since become defunct and has been substituted by the Competition Commission. But on the issue of pricing of GM seeds, again, state governments had taken some of the seed companies, particularly the large multinational corporations selling GM seeds, on the issue of pricing. So it's not only the biosafety issue, but also pricing issues as well as other issues that we will get into in the later end of the presentation that are important to see to capture the trend of how biosafety legislations are developing. There are also several committee reports that are useful to read and understand. These are committees, technical expert committees that have been set up by the Court of Law, the Supreme Court in the Aruna Rodriguez case, as well as multi-party parliamentary committees which have given their opinion and their recommendations on developing adequate biosafety legislation before going ahead with GMOs and LMOs. There have also been very vibrant people's campaigns and submissions made by concerned farmers and scientists on this issue. So, what are the standards of biosafety? Who prescribes that? There has to be some kind of scientific consensus on this issue. But like I mentioned before, the United States of America has its own standard on biosafety, and that is quote unquote substantial equivalence. That means it believes that LMOs and novel foods that are developed from genetically modified crops are equivalent or substantially equivalent to natural products which are not GMO. So it doesn't need any specific or special or more stricter legal standards for its regulation. And this has been the basis on which it has attempted to stall the biosafety protocol. There's another issue, that of intellectual property, which the United States of America has also pushed to get introduced in the World Trade Organization's IP agreement called TRIPS, in which everything is to be made patentable. What I'm trying to give you the link to biosafety is that there are other laws apart from biosafety laws, such as patent legislations or seed legislations, which also have a bearing on the issue of biosafety. For instance, our Plant Variety Protection Act 2001 in India requires that every application for registration of a plant variety must have an affidavit which states that it does not contain terminator technology. So there's no ban on the registration of GE varieties for IP protection, but biodiversity conservation is also a concern. And here, even the Central Biological Diversity Act of India, legislated in 2002, imposes obligations on the central government to take measures for biosafety. So biosafety is not just one regulation or one protocol that comes into play, but it can be covered through a whole range of legal measures. Let's summarize then. Biosafety is about ensuring the safety of human and ecological health when using LMOs. It relies heavily on the use of law, both at the national level and the international level, but it also requires a technological infrastructure to be able to test and detect for GMOs. Then the international law on biosafety is under the CBD, which has two specific sub-protocols on this issue under it. There are also 3 environmental law principles that form the basis of biosafety legislation. And then the law on biosafety in India is still developing, though we have a biosafety regime under the executive rules of 1989. And finally, several other laws have a bearing on the issue of biosafety. Thank you.